By the summer of 1945, American leaflets dropped over a dozen bypassed islands in the Pacific, made the same promise in almost the same words. Whatever ship a man was waiting for, none would appear. The leaflets named names: Rabaul, Truk, Bougainville, New Guinea, Wake. On each of them, by the last year of the war, sat a Japanese garrison numbering anywhere from a few thousand men to well over 100,000, dug into positions the United States had already decided, once and for all, never to attack. Put together, the men stranded on islands like these ran into the hundreds of thousands, sitting on real estate nobody in Washington had any further use for. Nobody had bothered telling the men holding those positions, which under the circumstances was a strange kind of mercy. So they kept training. Weeks before any leaflet reached a beach at Rabaul, a Japanese infantry company ran the same defense drill it had run every few days for the better part of 2 years, manning the trench line, sighting the machine guns on the reef approach, waiting for the whistle that signaled the end of it, then going back to the garden plots that fed them now that the ships bringing food had stopped coming. An NCO checked the same firing angles he had checked the week before and the week before that, on the theory that a landing force could appear on any given morning, and that the difference between living through it and not living through it might come down to a machine gun sighted a few degrees wrong. It was routine in the way weather is routine. No one on that beach in 1944 could have said with certainty that it was something like the 400th time they had rehearsed repelling a landing force that had, as a matter of settled American policy, no intention of ever being sent. General Hitoshi Imamura commanded more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors at Rabaul, on the island of New Britain, the largest single concentration of Japanese troops anywhere outside the home islands, alongside Vice Admiral Jinichi Kusaka, who ran what remained of the fleet's local air power. Rabaul had been built up over 2 years into the most heavily defended Japanese position south of the home islands, 4 working airfields, a harbor that had once sheltered most of the combined fleet at once, and gun emplacements enough to make a direct assault the kind of proposition no planner wanted to sign his name to. When American carriers hit the harbor hard enough in November 1943, Kusaka's order to his own men was 2 words: get underground. All hands mustered to dig and kept digging for the rest of the war until the volcanic rock beneath Rabaul held more than 300 miles of connecting tunnels, hospitals and barracks and workshops buried deep enough that the bombing overhead became, for men underground, mostly a sound. When the Navy stopped delivering food in any reliable quantity, sometime in 1943, Imamura ordered his men into the fields as well. Soldiers who had trained their whole careers for maneuver warfare learned to grow sweet potatoes and rice in volcanic soil, and to fish the waters the Allies now patrolled at will. By April 1944, with the last submarine gone, and an American landing at Hollandia, leaving Rabaul bypassed by some 700 miles, one officer summed up the position for the men still holding it. They would have to wait for a foe who might never come. Rabaul was not unusual in this. It was the largest example of something happening at once across a dozen islands most Americans back home could not have found on a map. Smaller garrisons on Nauru, on Mili and Jaluit in the Marshalls, on islands with names that never made a wartime headline once, were left to run the identical experiment on a smaller scale. Dig in, ration, drill, and wait for a landing force that had already been struck from the schedule before most of these men had finished building the positions they were waiting in. Wake Island had been cut off longer than any of them, seized by the Japanese in the last weeks of December 1941, and then abandoned by its own navy almost as fast once the United States decided the atoll was not worth retaking. American submarines patrolled the surrounding water, waiting for cargo ships that seldom sailed. Reinforcements kept arriving anyway for a while. 1,000 men from Manchuria landed by converted liner as late as January 1944, walking off the gangway into a base already running short on everything but rank. By May of that year, the garrison was rationing rice down from over 700 grams a day toward a few hundred, and the workday fell with it hour by hour until 5 men were needed to do the work of 1. Soldiers hunted the atoll's native rail, a small flightless bird, into extinction within about 2 years. And after the birds came the rats, tens of thousands of them killed and eaten in a single day when there was nothing else left to kill. By the war's end, total bomb and shell tonnage dropped on the garrison had passed 2,500 tons, nearly all of it after March 1944, across a spit of coral 4 square miles wide. In October 1943, carrier aircraft from USS Yorktown bombed and shelled Wake for 2 days, the heaviest attack the garrison had taken since its own capture of the atoll in December 1941. Rear Admiral Shigematsu Sakaibara, the island's commander, read the raid as the opening act of an invasion he had spent 2 years expecting any morning. 2 days later, fearing the 98 American civilian construction workers still held on the island would side with an invading force, he ordered them march to the north end of the atoll, blindfolded and machine-gunned. One man escaped the killing long enough to carve a message into a coral rock before he was recaptured. It read, 98 USPW, the date, killed. A year later, with nobody outside his own command yet aware of what had happened on that beach, Sakaibara was promoted to Rear Admiral. There was no invasion. There was never going to be one. The October raid Sakaibara died believing had been the beginning of the end for his command was, by the American Navy's own account, something far less dramatic, a live-fire exercise. Admiral Nimitz had ordered it as a warm-up for green carrier air groups on their way to bigger targets, a chance for pilots who had never dropped a bomb in anger to do so against a target that could barely shoot back. Nobody told Sakaibara that. Nobody was ever going to. He spent the rest of the war waiting for a second act that had already happened by accident and had already ended. By September 1945, when the garrison finally surrendered, starvation and disease had done what no American assault ever attempted. Of something like 2,200 men on the atoll, somewhere near 1,300 were dead, most of them from hunger, before the war ever reached a formal end. 18 months passed at the worst stretch between the day one Japanese transport left Wake's horizon and the day the next one appeared on it, and a number of the men who stood on the beach and watched the first ship go did not live to see whether a second one ever came. 4 months after the Wake massacre, in February 1944, the U.S. Navy hit the Japanese fleet anchorage at Truk with the same carrier power that had leveled Wake's defenses, except at a scale that made Wake look like a warning shot. Truk had been the combined fleet's forward base for most of the war, the anchorage where the battleships Yamato and Musashi had sat for months at a stretch, with 5 mined lagoon entrances guarding it, and a fuel depot holding more than 77,000 tons of oil, the largest Japanese fuel stockpile outside the home islands. 2 days of American carrier strikes sank more than 40 ships and destroyed several hundred aircraft, leaving an anchorage in such ruin that survivors of the raid took to calling it the Pacific's Pearl Harbor in reverse. The raid never meant to put a single American soldier ashore, and it did not. Truk's land garrison, nearly 28,000 Navy personnel, and close to 17,000 Army troops under Vice Admiral Chuichi Hara and Lieutenant General Shunzaburo Mugikura, spent the next 18 months the same way Rabaul's did, farming, rationing ammunition it could no longer replace, and waiting for a landing force that American planners had already crossed off every planning map in the building where such maps were kept. The Americans told them directly, in writing. Leaflets dropped over Wake, Rabaul, Truk, and the rest laid it out in plain English translated into Japanese. No ship was coming, no rescue was coming, and the men reading the leaflet were, in the exact language of the propaganda officers who wrote it, already cut off from the homeland for good. One leaflet even referenced an actual hospital ship, the Takasago Maru, that the American Navy had chosen to let through the blockade once to Wake, as a goodwill gesture, then told the other garrisons in the very next paragraph not to expect the same courtesy twice. A separate leaflet aimed at Bougainville, where somewhere between 12 and 25,000 Japanese troops still held out against a much smaller Australian force, invited the men reading it to compare their own situation to Wake's, naming Rabaul and Truk in the same breath, on the theory that a man who could see his own fate mirrored on 3 other islands at once might finally believe it applied to him too. Many of the men who read these leaflets did not believe a word of them. Propaganda said what propaganda always said. Somewhere behind the silence, someone in Tokyo was still planning something. Nobody in Tokyo was planning anything of the kind, because the decision that made all of this true had already been made in a conference room in Quebec in August 1943, more than a year before most of these leaflets were ever printed. General MacArthur wanted to take Rabaul directly. He said so at the time and said so again for the rest of his life. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall and the Joint Chiefs disagreed, weighing the cost of storming a fortress garrisoned by over 100,000 men against the cost of just sailing past it, cutting its supply lines, and leaving the defenders to a war of their own that nobody on the American side had to fight. The arithmetic on the table was not abstract. Fighting for New Georgia that same year, on a far smaller scale than Rabaul would have required, had already cost the Americans something like 1,100 dead and 4,000 wounded, a worse ratio than the Marines would take at Tarawa, the army at Kwajalein. The Joint Chiefs chose the second option at the Quadrant Conference that August, a single meeting, minuted and filed, that quietly canceled an invasion nobody on the receiving end would ever be told had been canceled. History would later credit the strategy to MacArthur himself, since his forces executed the bypass maneuvers that made it work. He is on record having wanted no part of the original decision. The same logic was applied to Truk without a second formal debate once Rabaul had proven it worked. Neutralize the base from the air, starve the garrison at leisure, and spend no American lives buying real estate nobody needed to own. For the rest of the war, on Rabaul's shrinking perimeter, the fiction held anyway. An Australian division relieved the exhausted Americans in late 1944, landed at Jackanaut Bay on New Britain's south coast, and pushed along both shorelines toward the fortress against opposition light enough that some weeks felt more like road building than combat, since the Japanese abandoned outlying ground rather than defend it. By early 1945, the advance had squeezed Imamura's remaining force onto the Gazelle Peninsula around the port itself, close to 93,000 men in an area a fraction of what they had once held. The Australians kept coming. Imamura kept training the men he had left, kept the gardens producing, and kept his main position intact, because he understood something his own high command back in Tokyo had stopped being able to promise him, that no relief was coming, and no attack strong enough to need one was coming either. The Australian division facing him had nowhere near enough strength to take the peninsula by force, and both sides, by 1945, knew it. Rear Admiral Sakaibara had reacted to an invasion that was a training exercise by killing 98 men who posed him no threat and was hanged for it in 1947. General Imamura reacted to 2 years of that same waiting by declining to react at all, holding his perimeter, feeding his men, and fighting no battle that was not put directly in front of him. He had been ordered early on to preserve his strength until he could act together with the Navy, and he never stopped following that order, even after it was obvious no combined action was coming either. Post-war historians examining the Rabaul campaign, the Japanese military historian Kengoro Tanaka among them, working from the same order of battle Imamura had, concluded that any large-scale offensive out of the fortress would have accomplished nothing. His own command lacked the naval and air support to exploit, even if it succeeded. He had gotten the situation right without ever learning why, arriving at the right answer to a question Quebec had already settled a year before he ever had to ask it. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the cruiser USS Portland, Vice Admiral Chuichi Hara and Lieutenant General Shunzaburo Mugikura surrendered Truk and its garrison, roughly 130,000 military personnel and civilians combined, the largest single Japanese surrender of the Pacific War. American officers who came ashore to inventory the position found ammunition stores sufficient to fight for another month, coastal batteries still manned, and radar stations still tracking every plane that flew within range. All of it maintained on a schedule that had never once needed to be used. The men who had kept that schedule going for 18 months packed their own gear for the trip home while American clerks counted crates of shells nobody was ever going to fire at anybody. 4 days later, aboard the carrier HMS Glory, anchored off New Britain, General Hitoshi Imamura signed the surrender of Rabaul. Neither ceremony had a beachhead behind it. Neither needed one. The invasion both men had spent years preparing for arrived, in the end, as a folder of paperwork carried aboard a ship that had never once fired on them. At Rabaul, the Australians who took Imamura's surrender did not even bother shipping his men home right away. Close to 70,000 soldiers and 20,000 civilians were interned on New Britain itself, ordered to build their own camps and keep the same garden plots producing that had fed them through the whole of the siege, because the Australians had learned in detail what Imamura's garrison could grow without outside help, and saw no reason to feed 100,000 men from Sydney when the men could keep feeding themselves. Some of them stayed at that work for close to 2 years after the war that never came to them was already over. There's a small museum on what used to be Truk Lagoon's waterline that tells this version of the story to almost nobody and would not mind the company.